welcome to the Fan of History. Today we are going to talk about the 940s BC. First, the regular disclaimer: I'm just a fan of history and not a history scientist by any means. I've done decade reports for all the decades of before this one. The sources for this period are weak and vague, and I want you to watch the great civilizations of the world in 1000 BC on this channel and the previous reports before looking at this one. I have a new microphone, so please let me know how the sound is. I have tested this on another YouTube channel and it seems to improve the quality of the audio a lot. So I hope this helps. So, the 940s. Around this time, 950 or 949, something happens in Kush. So let's talk about Kush. We mentioned it in the 1000 BC show. Kush is the region south of Egypt after the first cataract of the Nile. It was part of Egypt until the fall of the New Kingdom, roughly in 1070 BC. The New Kingdom, the great period of Egypt, they put up a viceroy in Kush, and he was called the son of the Pharaoh. There was a colonial government in Kush. There were temples built in Kush. Overall, Kush was very heavily influenced by Egypt. And when the New Kingdom power disappeared, Kush started out as a nation very heavily Egyptianized, but eventually the land was taken over by non-Egyptianized forces. And Kush disappears from the historical record, and it's actually later in this decade that the Egyptians once again mentions Kush as a trading partner, but I don't know if they mention Aserkami. But here's the event. In the year 950 BC or 949 BC, Aserkami, the king of Kush, attacks Egypt. And we know almost nothing about this. It might be a fable. I haven't really found anything on it, but there is an attack by Kush on Egypt. And if you go north from Kush, you end up in close to Thebes and the region controlled by the high priest of Amun. But even if this attack did not happen, Kush has surely learned a lot from Egypt and will put it to good use. And this is not the last thing we hear about the Nubians in Kush. Kush is alternatively called Nubia or Kush. So if I confuse you, it's not intentional. Moving on to Troy. Troy is the archaeological site of Troy is located in Turkey. I hope you understand what this means, what this map shows. And Troy 7b3 is deserted at this time. That's pure archaeology, and we don't know what was going on in Troy. And this is not the Troy of the Iliad, that's a much earlier Troy, probably in 1200 BC. This episode we will talk a lot about Egypt, so let's start. In 945 BC, Susenes II, the pharaoh of Egypt, dies, and he's a mystery pharaoh. We don't know a lot about him. We don't even know if he also was Susenes III, the high priest of Amun. But there is no more record of Susenes III after this happens, and that's one of the strongest pieces of evidence for the fact that Susenes II and Susenes III was the same person. And with Susenes II, the 21st Dynasty of Egypt ends. And as I promised, we know a whole lot about his successor, Shoshenq, and we'll talk more about him very soon. But first, let's remember the 21st Dynasty of Egypt. The 21st Dynasty ruled Egypt from 1077 BC to 945 BC. That's 132 years. That's a long time. It started with Smendes, and by the fall of the last Ramses in 1077 BC, power was split already between Herihor, the high priest of Amun in Thebes, and Smendes in Tanis, who was some sort of military commander. I'll talk more about that when we do the 1070s BC show. But Herihor and his great power, he was the first of a high priest of Amun to write his name in a cartouche, and he sort of divided Egypt. And Egypt stayed divided during this dynasty, but it was still a much stronger dynasty. This is the third intermediary period, the period between the New Kingdom and other times in Egypt's history. And this is one of the stronger dynasties still. And the greatest pharaoh of this dynasty was Susanus I, who we just missed in these 10th century shows, because he died in 1001 BC. And this is his death mask. So look at the might of Susanus I, Pharaoh of Egypt. So these were the 8 pharaohs of the 21st dynasty: Mendes, Amenemnisu, Pinedjem, Susanus I, Amenembe, Osorkon the Elder, who was a Libyan, Siamun, and Susanus II. And if you remember, if you look back and try to summarize this dynasty, you can find that after the reign of Ramses III, which was 200 years before this, a long, slow decline started. And overall, the split of power between the high priest and the pharaoh is the thing that defines this dynasty. There's really not much to say, but Egypt is still declining. Who can stop that? Well, maybe Shoshenq can. But first, let's go to China. King Mu, perhaps the greatest ruler China ever had, and quite definitely the greatest ruler of the Zhou dynasty. He ruled China. He will live until he's 105 years old, according to some sources. So he's still going strong, but we don't have any dated events from the 940s. So check the last episode for more on King Mu and his adventures in the 950s BC. And he's still more ambitious than wise. So, the 22nd dynasty begins in Egypt. We don't know how power transferred to Shoshenq, the great chief of the Ma. But it is then very likely that Susanus I, the last pharaoh of the 21st dynasty, united Egypt and was the high priest and the pharaoh. And it is likely that Shoshenq was the military commander. He was the great chief of the Ma. He controlled the Libyan tribe in the north. And his dynasty will be called the Libyan or the Bubastite dynasty, because they originated and maybe ruled Egypt from the Bubastus, which is a city in the delta. So Shoshenq is very clearly Libyan and not an Egyptian. But what does that mean? Was there a Libyan invasion? No, there wasn't. Because Ramses III, again, we're 200 years after Ramses III, we're still talking about him because he was so awesome. And he crushed the Libyans, he crushed the sea peoples, he saved Egypt, he saved the world. But all those Libyans he took prisoners and brought to Egypt. And he had Libyans serving in the army. So the Libyans were strong in the army, and the Ma in particular. Remember Osorkon? He had already ruled as a pharaoh of the 21st dynasty, and he was a Libyan. So I think what happened was, this is now me guessing, so it has no historical value at all, but power in Egypt transferred by women. So you could inherit the role of pharaoh by marrying an important daughter of the old pharaoh, and Shoshenq marries the daughter of Susanus II. So I think he is just inheriting. He's not claiming power by military might, but I think he's just inheriting the crowns. And then he's just ruling Egypt because he's the military commander. But Egypt is now uniquely united. Egypt is united finally. And Shoshenq is a strong and capable military leader. And this is his swings. So maybe it doesn't show a lot. It's very traditional. There is the fake beard of the pharaoh. And yeah, it just looks like any random pharaoh. But Shoshenq's rule will be a high point in the third intermediary period, and he's one of the great pharaohs of Egypt that still remains after the New Kingdom. So Shoshenq is going to make sure that power is not divided in Egypt again, and power will still become divided during the 22nd dynasty. But Shoshenq does a lot. First, he terminates the hereditary succession of the high priesthood of Amun in Thebes. So no more high priests going crazy in Thebes. And he puts his son Euput as the governor of Upper Egypt. So Euput rules Thebes and the area around it. Jeptehaufunk, that guy, becomes the third prophet of Amun, very important in the Amun priesthood. He's also son of Sheshonq, and Sheshonq also puts his son Nimlot as the military commander at Heracleopolis near Thebes. But his most important son, called Osorkon II, is still with daddy in then Tanis or Babustus in the Delta. Egypt is united and the pharaohs will rule Egypt from the Delta. And this is a problem. It's not a problem for the pharaohs because the Delta is a great place to rule from, but it's a problem for us because in the Delta is a wet place. In Thebes and in Upper Egypt you have desert, like things last forever. You know, the mummies, there's a natural process of mummification if you just put people on the ground pretty much. But not in the Delta. In the Delta stuff is destroyed by wetness, and so we know very little about this dynasty from archaeology. One thing we know is that they still bury the sacred bull. So we have some inscriptions from the burying of the sacred bull that these pharaohs do. But archaeology is not a great source here for this dynasty because they are living in the swamp. It's not a swamp. So what's happening in Europe during this time? Well, we don't have a clue, except that Bronze Age stuff is still going on. Iron has reached Athens, perhaps, and some places very close to Asia, but it hasn't come far yet. In 942 BC, Mar-Biti-Ahe-Idina becomes the king of Babylon after his brother ends his long reign. His brother was Ninurta-Kudurri-Usur II. Mar-Biti-Ahe-Idina is known only from King's List. And why are we still talking about Babylon? Babylon is a very, very weak place in the 10th century BC. But look at the map here. They are close to the Arameans, they're close to Elam. They are close to this area in the Zagros Mountains that will become important. And they are also very close to Assyria. And more importantly, the Babylonians have a very, very important place in the Assyrians' hearts because they respect Babylon. And we will see this again and again in the coming 30 episodes, that Babylon is still an important place despite having almost no power. So what about these Aramean kingdoms and the trouble they caused for Babylon? The Arameans were a tribal people that preferred to occupy the wilderness. They had been around forever, there are early mentions of it, but during the Bronze Age collapse in the 12th century BC, they become very important and they spread out and they destroy stuff. They fight Tiglath-Pileser I of Assyria, the greatest king of the Middle Assyrian Empire. And in the end, the Arameans wreck the Middle Assyrian Empire, causing the Assyrians to retreat to their heartland around the city of Ashur. The Arameans also has a very easy language to learn, and we will talk more about the Aramean language because that will become extremely important later. And you remember Jesus spoke Aramean. The population centers of the Arameans are called Aram or Bit. So Aram Damascus will be a very important place soon. But the fact that there are population centers means that Arameans are settling down and they're influenced by the Neo-Hittites. The Neo-Hittites still haven't gotten over that the Hittite Empire has fallen. So they are keeping up the show in southeastern Turkey. They're building palaces and they are in contact with the Arameans a lot. And they influence the Arameans and cause the Arameans to settle down. And we'll have a look at the Bit-Bahiani, which is one of the Aramean Neo-Hittite synergy kingdoms. It is located here in southern Turkey, northern Syria. It was founded in the 10th century BC by King Kapara, who built a palace in the Neo-Hittite style. We have these small Neo-Hittite Aramean kingdoms appearing in Syria and Turkey. But wait a minute here. What if... So the Arameans kept the Assyrians in check, but they're now settling down. So who is keeping the Assyrians in check? Well, in Assyria, Tiglath-Pileser II is still the king. He will rule until 935 BC. But the neighboring tribes are now starting to settle down. The Assyrians have found a lot of iron, and they know Iron Age technology very well now, maybe better than anyone else, and they are switching to iron weapons. They have the iron and the technology, and they have been the best warriors in the world for a long time. Watch my video about the history of Assyria for between the years 3000 and 1000 BC, and you'll find that the Assyrians have been forged into these superb warriors by their geographical location, where everybody has been fighting them. And the doomsday clock is ticking. Soon we have this city filled with crazy warriors, skilled warriors with the best weapons in the world. So what can they do? Turns out they can do quite a bit. In India, Kuru is a strong state in the north, but we'll have to wait until the next century before we can actually say anything about India. And the Olmec civilization is going on there in Mexico, and we actually know a little, not as much as we knew in last episode. Please also look at the PowerPoint culture up here, because that is happening now. We'll talk about that later. After the troubles that happened to the Olmecs in the 950s, you remember everything happened to them in the 950s. Rivers were changing course, they were fighting, and the open city of San Lorenzo is now diminished. It has lost a lot of its power, and La Venta is rising. La Venta is easier to defend, and La Venza is going to be important. And for the random fact about the Olmecs, this time we'll talk about their diet. So close to the Gulf of Mexico, but they still are not eating seafood, because their most important source of protein is dogs. They eat their dogs all the time. They have lots and lots of dogs, and they eat them more than they eat anything else with protein. So the next episode will be the events of the 930s BC. I will release it on April the 28th. I do these weekly reports about the decades, and I will keep doing them at least until 800 BC, and then we'll talk. You can discuss the show with me here on YouTube or on Facebook. There are the addresses. If you like and share and subscribe this stuff, it helps me to keep going beyond 800 BC, so please do. Thank you for watching, and speak to you next week.